Good day. Once upon a time, and for all I know still, there was an expression widely used within the English legal community, both within the court and amongst practicing lawyers, which referred to a situation where somebody sought to distract the listener with an ocean of words, none of which, on careful analysis and precise scrutiny, meant anything. The expression was "bullshit baffles brains." The device, this practice of saying lots of things, using often complicated and intricate and in times jargonesque language, this practice was usually used by lawyers in order to conceal the fact that they were actually flying on empty, that they had nothing, in fact, to say, and that they had no real case or argument to make. Well, I don't know whether this expression is used in America, but we had a prime example of this on the 25th of January 2022 at a briefing before in the White House to discuss the prospective massive sanctions that the United States government has been talking about for several days and which would be imposed allegedly on Russia in the event that this mythological invasion by Russia of Ukraine were to take place. Now, before I proceed to discuss what actually was said at this rather bizarre briefing, I would make one observation. I've said in the past that one of the things that I actually do commend the Biden-Harris administration for doing is the fact that they do have these press briefings in which US officials, the US administration officials, discuss and explain to the press corps aspects of US policy. Even though these briefings are obviously tightly controlled affairs, it does mean that we do have an insight to some of the thinking within the White House. The very fact, for example, that this briefing was largely bullshit is an opportunity, is an opportunity for us to understand what the true range of options available to the US government actually is. But there is one aspect to this practice which I absolutely do not approve of and do not agree with. And that is this practice of having these briefings conducted by someone known as a senior administration official whose identity is supposedly not to be disclosed. The administration, of course, knows who this person is. The press corps obviously know who this person is. The Russians and the Chinese, who have elaborate intelligence operations and an active embassies in Washington, D.C., they too surely know who this person is. So why are we not told who this person is? Why is this person, this senior administration official, not identified? After all, everything this person says is made public, so it can't be to conceal what this person says, nor is there any real doubt about the fact that this person is a senior administration official because he or she is providing their briefings in the White House press room. So why exactly is the identity of this person concealed? It makes absolutely no sense. I would suggest that it is to give this whole appearance, these briefings, an appearance of mystery and importance which their contents do not justify. If we're going to go for transparency, which we should, then it seems to me that it makes no sense to conceal the identity of the briefer, and let's have it out there, know exactly who this person is on every occasion when they speak. Anyway, enough about that. Let's go to this briefing itself. And it is a really remarkable episode, a very strange affair, because it is the briefing in which the United States government briefs the American media on these sanctions, these devastating sanctions that the United States is going to impose upon Russia, and to explain its contingency planning. So we read from the moderator, whoever that is, that the call today is about our ongoing efforts to answer questions on the severe economic costs the US will impose on Russia with allies and partners if Russia invades Ukraine. And then we also learn all sorts of things about how there's been lots of discussions about these sanctions, and that they're prepared to implement sanctions with massive consequences that were not considered into 2014. That means the gradualism of the past is out, and this time we'll start at the top of the escalation ladder and stay there. We've made efforts to signal this intention very clearly. Now, before I go into what in fact these massive sanctions are going to be, let's just take a step back and consider that particular phrase. We're told that these are sanctions that were not considered in 2014, and there's been some suggestion that the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2014 were an instance of gradualism. They were supposedly relatively mild sanctions, supposed to act as some kind of deterrent or warning against the Russian government, and intended to be presumably scaled up if the Russians continued to behave in ways that were not acceptable to the United States. Well, that's what is said about these sanctions now, but I want to make it absolutely clear. I followed all the sanctions discussions back in 2014. That emphatically was not what was said in 2014. The sanctions, the sectoral sanctions which were imposed in 2014 were expected to be utterly devastating to the Russian economy. In fact, I remember reading, I believe in the Financial Times, that Angela Merkel at the time was briefed by the German intelligence agency, the BND, that these sanctions would be so devastating to Russia that the oligarchs who Westerners believe control Russian policy would tell Putin either to back down over Ukraine or force him out of power if he didn't do so. And in fact, the sanctions were carefully calibrated to achieve that effect. Firstly, they essentially cut Russian banks off from external funding, not just, by the way, the state banks, which were the specific targets of the sanctions, but all Russian banks. For a period of several years, it was all but impossible for Russian banks or for financial institutions of any sort, even those that were not sanctioned, to raise funds in international money markets. And in addition to that, there was sanctions which prevented the export of dual-use technologies to Russia, and sanctions which targeted equipment for the Russian oil and gas industry. And the idea behind the sanctions which were imposed in 2014, was that the Russians would be cut off from external sources of funding, and at the same time, the sanctions against the oil and gas industry and the dual-use sanctions would make it impossible, supposedly, for the Russians to keep oil and gas production running at proper levels. So over time, Russian oil and gas production would fall, and with no source of external funding, the Russian economy would run out of money and would crash, and the result would be either that the Russians backed down over Ukraine, capitulated completely, handed back Crimea to Ukraine, and all that, or faced a total economic collapse. That was the idea. That was the concept behind the sanctions, which were imposed in 2014. Except, of course, it didn't turn out like that. Firstly, the Russians very rapidly developed their own financial system in Russia, so that the vast bulk of funding both for the government and, by the way, for Russian corporates, is now raised within the Russian financial sector itself. Russia today, the Russian government, has developed a sophisticated system of issuing bonds on Russian financial markets, the so-called OFZs, which cover its funding needs. The Russian government also successfully preserved its existing foreign currency reserves by taking a step which Western governments, when they imposed the sanctions, had not expected, which is that Russia floated the ruble so that it became less dependent upon oil and gas revenues than it had been before. But most important of all, the expectation that the Russians would not be able to replace the equipment, the high technology equipment that they were supposedly importing from the West to maintain production levels in their oil and gas sector, that proved to be utterly wrong. Instead of Russian oil and gas production declining as expected, causing a financial crisis in Russia, oil and gas production in Russia since 2014 has remained stable and has in fact even risen to some extent. So the 2014 sanctions were not a case of a gradualist approach. Rather, they were a case of sanctions which were imposed and which then immediately proceeded to fail. Anyway, we then get the next self-comforting lie which appears in this briefing. And we come back to what the senior administration official says. He says, I would say the deepening sell-off in Russian markets, its borrowing costs, the value of its currency, market implied default risk, reflect the severity of the economic consequences we can and will impose on the Russian economy in the event of a further invasion. There was a sell-off in Russian markets, and no doubt that was to some extent connected with geopolitical risks. But of course, what the senior administration official is not mentioning is that there was, at the same time, a sell-off in European financial markets also, and of course in the financial markets in the United States. And the reason for this are growing concerns about the tightening of monetary policy in the United States itself. The effect of the Federal Reserve Board scaling down its QE program, looking to unwind some of the asset purchases it has been engaging in for so long, and possibly raising interest rates, is that the dollar is hardening, and this is having an effect against most currencies around the world, and is causing dollars to flow back to the United States. It is also, by the way, affecting US corporates and US financial markets, which are heavily overextended and overborrowed. I'm not saying that the fall in Russian markets was entirely due to this, but I suspect it was largely due to this. And it was, as I said, part of the larger sell-off that has been taking place all around the world. Anyway, we now come to the financial sanctions. And one of the very interesting things about these financial sanctions is that the senior administration advisor tells us that they're going to happen, but is extremely vague. In fact, doesn't say anything about what they are. He says that these financial sanctions would restrict foreign capital, presumably money flowing into Russia, but nowhere in this briefing is there any mention, for example, of disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT interbank messaging and payment system. So I assume that means that idea is definitely has definitely been ditched following objections, not just from the Germans, but from across Europe as well. And it looks as if the only actual financial sanctions that are going to be imposed are sanctions against buying Russian sovereign debt. Well, as I said, Russia increasingly doesn't sell sovereign debt on international money markets. It sells sovereign debt in Russian money markets, and the people who buy it are Russian investors and Russian financial institutions, very much as happens, by the way, in the developed world. So this is an annoying sanction, but not an existential one, as it might have been if it had been imposed, say, 20 years ago. And presumably also what Joe Biden was talking about in his press conference a short time ago, a decision to prevent Russian banks, certain big Russian banks, from holding or trading in dollars. However, since, as we will see, there is a extreme anxiety and concern, as is expressed by the senior administration official, that Russian oil and gas exports continue to Europe, one must assume that since the Europeans pay for Russian gas in euros and realistically can only pay for Russian gas in euros, those big Russian financial institutions will still be able to hold and trade in euros. Given, as I have already said, that the Russians, most of Russia's trade now is carried out with Europe in euros, again, preventing big Russian banks from holding dollars is not going to be that existential disaster for Russia that it might once have been. I would actually go further than this, and I would say that if we actually talk about this as an actual plan, then it is perhaps a sanction which more than any other would call into question the reserve currency status of the dollar, because it would mean that trading between two major economic blocs, Russia and the European Union, would no longer be conducted in dollars. They would be conducted in euros instead, so that the US dollar's primacy in world energy markets would have been severely dented. But if that's the way the United States wants to go, if it wants to undermine the position of the dollar, if it wants to set up alternative currency systems, in this case the euro, which could take its place, well, I suppose that's a matter for them. And then that brings us to the question of the gas and energy issues. And here it's very clear, if you actually go through what the what is being talked about here by the senior administration official, there's actually an assumption, very much a hope, that Russian oil and gas exports to Europe would continue. And the assumption is that the Russians will want to continue with these exports because, of course, they have no alternative to doing so. And we have some really rather interesting comments. The senior administration official, or rather actually the moderator, says the following. Remember, this is a one-dimensional economy. That means it needs oil and gas revenues at least as much as Europe needs its energy supply. So remember, oil and gas revenues are 2/3 of the total in Russia. 2/3 of what total in Russia? And about half of Russia's federal budget revenues. So this is not an asymmetric advantage for Putin. It is an interdependency. Well, let's take a step back and think about that. Even if that were true, there would be a difference. Because even if the Russians are as dependent financially on oil and gas revenues as these officials, these US officials appear to say, it seems to me, a profound difference between what the Russians would face if their oil and gas exports to Europe were to be cut off and what the Europeans would face. Russia is self-sufficient in energy. In other words, if there was a total cut-off of oil and gas exports to Europe, Russia would continue to have enough oil and gas to keep its industries running, its homes warm, its cities lit. Europe might find itself in a very different situation. So if the Europeans found themselves facing rolling blackouts, especially in winter during cold weather, if much of European industry were at a standstill, well, it might not be quite so valid then to talk about an interdependency. It would be a situation where certainly one country was taking a major hit by losing a large part of its export revenues, but another, its major trading partner, would find itself in very considerable economic difficulty. But, in fact, it's not even as these officials appear to say, because they talk about Russia being a one-dimensional economy, as if it is, in effect, Saudi Arabia with snow. But, of course, it isn't. Russia is an immense, highly diversified economy, has a very large industrial sector, much bigger than these people appear to realize. It has a very advanced and highly developed service industry. It has a very strong agricultural sector, which means that it now, to all intents and purposes, feeds itself and exports food around the world. It has a large mining sector, which provides it with pretty much all the strategic minerals that it requires. It is, in other words, a fully diversified economy. One gets different figures for the exact proportion that the oil and gas sector accounts for in Russian GDP. Its figures vary from around 10%, which is, I suspect, roughly the true measure, up to a quarter. But certainly it isn't, Russia isn't as dependent on energy, on its energy industries, as these people appear to think it is. And certainly it isn't the one-dimensional economy that they imagine. To be straightforward about this, Russia has its own tech companies, it has its own tech architecture, very much like the United States does. It has, as I said, advanced industrial sectors, and of course it also has numerous export partners which would presumably want to still continue to buy Russian oil and gas. China, unquestionably. India, very probably, which puts it in a completely different league from what these administration officials appear to think. So even if Russian oil and gas exports to Europe were to completely, entirely stop, no doubt it would be a major hit for the Russian budget, but the Russian economy would adjust, and it would adjust fairly quickly. There would be a hit. Living standards would no doubt take a hit. The budget would have to be cut back. Taxes might have to be increased. They are, by the way, in Russia, very low. At least income taxes are. But overall, there's no doubt that Russia would be able to survive this, especially given the very large financial reserves that they already have, and, of course, the fact that the Russian government would almost certainly, almost immediately respond by going to a kind of mobilization system. In other words, it would be making sure that Russian capital markets were protected, that Russian industry and Russian investors and Russian households continued to be adequately heated and provided for, that food continued to circulate, that industrial goods continued to circulate through the system. So it would not be the disastrous blow, the calamitous blow that these officials imagine, because, as I said, the Russian economy is not the one-dimensional economy that they fantasize. And on the topic of the Russian federal budget, again, there is a fundamental misunderstanding about how Russia raises funds and how the Russian budget system works. Russia has two budgets. It has what is called the consolidated budget, which is the revenue that the government receives across Russia. That consolidated budget is then divided up, with the Russian government parceling out funds from the consolidated budget to the various regions. And then there is the federal budget, which operates and carries out its own funding. Now, even if you take the consolidated budget altogether, oil and gas revenues are not the largest item in the consolidated budget. Payroll taxes are, and in fact the share of oil and gas revenues has been steadily declining and is probably around a fifth of budget revenue. And always remember that even if there was a complete cut-off of exports to Europe, there would still be exports, that Russia would still be able to export oil and gas to other customers. So we would not be looking at a complete stop of oil and gas revenues entirely. We're talking about oil revenues especially. Oil revenues, by the way, being more important for the Russian budget than gas revenues. I suspect that they would continue pretty much as before. So this is not, I think, again, anywhere near to being, anywhere close to being the disastrous hit to the Russian budget that these officials imagine. But of course, we're talking anyway about a fantasy scenario, because it's absolutely clear that there are no plans to restrict Russian export of oil and gas to Europe. And in fact, we see that this is actually admitted. So if we go back to what that moderator, that one of those officials actually says, I want to make one key point that I've seen missing in the coverage. If Russia decides to weaponize its supply of natural gas or crude oil, it wouldn't be without consequences to the Russian economy. In other words, the administration does not plan to cut off Russian oil and gas exports. It's only game planning for the possibility that the Russians themselves do so. Well, why would they do so? Why would the Russians cut off their own major source of funding? So we're not going to get a disconnection from SWIFT. We're not going to get restrictions, sanctions against Russian energy exports to Europe. The only thing that we're looking at the moment is a possibility that certain Russian banks are prevented from using the dollar. And as I've said already, it's not clear how that would be beneficial to the United States, since they would quickly switch to using the euro, and restrictions on Russian foreign debt, which really aren't very meaningful anymore. It's quite likely that the Russians would limit or reduce their exports of gas and oil to Europe. That might be their long-term plan, but then that's probably their long-term plan anyway, because as I've discussed in many previous programs, they're now well on the way to increasing their exports of oil and gas to Asian customers, specifically and primarily to China, but also in the long term to India, as they gradually wind down their exports of oil and gas to Europe. So this is a policy the Russians would no doubt continue with incrementally, but there's no reason to think that in response to these sanctions, the Russians would simply switch off the energy flow to Europe. It would continue to be beneficial to them. And of course, from their point of view, the very fact that it is continuing means that the Europeans are resisting any idea of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, and of course are apparently or presumably proposing to pay Russia in euros, which of course assists the Russian policy of de-dollarizing the Russian economy and de-dollarizing Russia's foreign trade. So it seems to me that, again, these financial sanctions are really quite a little beside the point. But then there is perhaps what is the most unreal or surreal part of the whole discussion, because and the part where perhaps the bullshit is at its most elaborate level, because there is then a prolonged discussion about how the United States has been going around the world discussing with various countries ways of rerouting natural gas to Europe in the event that there was this fictional, this imaginary total cut-off of Russian gas supplies. And there's an enormous amount of discussion about this. There's talk about liquefied natural gas, ships, with liquefied natural gas heading towards Europe instead of to Asia, about surge production by producers like, Qatar and Australia and all the rest. All of this to make up for the possibility that the Russians reduce or stop their natural gas exports. Well, one of the fascinating things about this whole discussion, and you can read it in the briefing, the readout, which, as I said, is linked to this video, is that there is never at any point any confirmation that in the event that there was a total cut-off of gas exports by the Russians to Europe, that all of these measures would be able to substitute and replace that Russian gas supply. In fact, there's no admission, there's no confirmation of that, and that essentially confirms that this whole discussion is, again, a fanciful and fantastic one. There's no confirmation either that these other gas producers, presumably we're talking about countries like Algeria, Qatar, and Australia. There are major producers of Russian natural gas in Central Asia, but they depend on the Russian pipeline network. So presumably the US is not in conversation with these people, with those countries. But there's no suggestion anywhere in this discussion that these producers have actually said that they would be able to increase natural gas production to the point of replacing Russia. So again, there's no suggestion of that. There's lots of talk about discussions with these countries about doing it, but no actual confirmation that these producers could in fact do it. And perhaps the most important aspect of all, there is no discussion of cost and there is no discussion of price. There is no discussion of how much it would cost Western governments to try to substitute, to try to replace Russian natural gas supplies. And there is no discussion either of what would happen to natural gas prices worldwide, including, by the way, in the United States itself, if Russian gas supplies to Europe stopped and there were attempts made to divert natural gas from around the world to Europe to make up the difference. The reality is that if anything like that were to happen, natural gas prices would explode. We would be seeing a surge in natural gas prices beyond anything we have seen before. And all these measures, all these desperate measures that we're hearing about, some of which, like the talk about surges in production, have the look of emergency expedients, none of this would have any effect on that surge in prices. On the contrary, it would merely intensify the enormous problems. And of course, there's another factor which these administration officials don't mention and perhaps are oblivious to, which is, of course, that natural gas, is an essential component in production of mineral fertilizer, which is vital for the world's agricultural industries, including those in the United States. If natural gas from around the world is being diverted to Europe in order to make up for a sudden disappearance of Russian natural gas in Europe, then that by definition means that there is less natural gas available, far less natural gas available for producing chemical fertilizer, at which point there is less chemical fertilizer available, at which point food production falls and food prices around the world spike. There is no acknowledgement, understanding, admission, or comment about this in this very strange discussion. All of this, by the way, leads me to think that these officials, having effectively dropped, the administration effectively having dropped the idea of disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT interbank payment system, and having accepted that Russian banks can continue to trade in euros, are gambling that the Russians will still continue to export gas to Europe, and that all these bizarre ideas of transferring or moving gas around, liquefied natural gas around from around the world, that none of this will have to be done. Now, I think basically that is right. I don't think that the Russians would simply stop all export of gas to Europe. But in a sanctions war, one can never be completely sure. And of course, there is another thing to say, which is that the Russians don't need to stop all natural gas supply to Europe. They can do something else instead. They can do what they have been doing for much of last year and are still doing this year, which is only supply gas that they are contracted to supply under long-term contracts. not supply additional gas on the spot market, keeping the gas situation, the natural gas situation in Europe extremely tight, and perhaps over time, as they make their contracts with Asian customers, with the Indians, with the Chinese and the rest, and they start diverting pipeline gas to East Asia, perhaps they will stop at that point renewing those long-term contracts with the Europeans. At which point, the Europeans, in a couple of years' time, not very long by the way, because these contracts are renewed all the time. There are always some long-term gas contracts which are in the process of renewal. These European customers would be faced with a steady reduction of Russian natural gas supplies. And that's going to be extremely difficult for the Europeans to deal with, because with windmills now clearly unable to replace Russian natural gas, with Nord Stream 2 presumably mothballed and gone, with transit via Ukraine essentially stopped, European natural gas prices are going to spike over time, putting a heavy burden on European industries and European consumers and households. And one can always come up with projects. One can talk about building lots of new nuclear powered stations, for example. There would be problems with doing that, but that is a long-term, it's a very long-term project that would take about 10, 20 years to start to bear fruit. And of course the alternative, which is to start introducing fracking, works in some places in Europe, but not to anything like the extent that it does in the United States. And it is ecologically controversial anyway. So it's easy to see how the Russians could play this in a way that is very damaging to the Europeans, whilst at the same time mitigating their losses if there was a natural gas war. But regardless, the big take here is that the United States has in effect accepted that there cannot be sanctions on supplies of natural gas, Russian natural gas, to Europe. And if you drill through, as I said, all the ocean of words, the bullshit, it's pretty obvious that the United States isn't really in a position to replace that gas, and that all this talk with alternative suppliers, Qatar, Algeria, and the rest, doesn't really address or find a solution to the problem. And in fact, it turns out that the real sanctions, the only sanctions that the US is really focused on, is talking about exports of high technology goods. And you have a very interesting paragraph about this. It says, the reason they work is this. If you step back and look at the global dominance of US origin software, technology and tooling, the export control options we are considering alongside our allies and partners would hit Putin's strategic ambitions to industrialize his economy quite hard, and it would impair areas that are of importance to him, whether it's in artificial intelligence or quantum computing or defense or aerospace or other key sectors. Now, it's very interesting because actually when you look at what is being talked about, the restrictions, it seems that plans to stop exports of iPhones and components for iPhones and that sort of thing, in other words, consumer electronics and the rest, have been dropped. One isn't entirely certain about this, but that's a little bit how it looks. And now the emphasis is not on consumer electronics, which I think even the US realizes the Russians and the Chinese would be able to replace quite easily. The emphasis instead is on high-end products, US origin software, technology, tooling, and the rest. And here again, we come back to the fundamental error in this whole discussion, because it is predicated on the assumption that Russia is a one-dimensional economy, that it is not technologically advanced, that the Russians depend on Western technology exclusively for their industrialization programs. Now, I come back to what I said about those technology exports that were imposed as part of the 2014 sanctions package. The fact that the prohibition on exports to the Russian energy industry, the oil and gas industry, drilling equipment and all that sort of thing, it was expected that the Russians would not be able to replace it, and that it would lead to a decline in Russian oil and gas production. And that hasn't happened, because the Russians have proved capable of replacing all the equipment, the Western equipment that was previously no longer being that they were previously importing. So if the Russians can do that with their oil and gas sector, why can't they do that in other sectors as well? There's talk about aerospace, for example. Well, the United States has tried to restrict Russian aerospace development. It's made it more difficult for example, for the Russians to import aircraft engines from the United States. But the Russians are now busy themselves building aircraft engines. They have projects like the PD-14, high bypass turbofan, which is now in production. They have a further project for the PD-35 high bypass turbofan, which is going to be a big engine comparable to the bigger engines produced by Pratt & Whitney and General Electric. There's apparently plans to build an even bigger engine, the PD-50. A couple of years ago, the United States blocked exports of carbon fiber technology to prevent the Russians building carbon fiber wings for their new narrow body passenger jet, the MS-21. Well, it delayed that project by 18 months, but the Russians were able to develop their own carbon fiber technology, and were able to build wings, carbon fiber wings, using their own technology, using their own products to replace those embargoed by the US. And the same is true in sector after sector. To give an example, one particular example, which is microchips. The Russians 20 years ago essentially stopped building microchips. There was a microchip industry, an industry building microchips in the last years of the Soviet Union, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, that industry essentially collapsed also. Well, the Russians now do build microchips, and some years ago, in fact quite a few years ago, around 2011, they took a decision that all Russian military equipment would only use Russian-made microchips. And this has been one of the major reasons, by the way, why some Russian military programs, like the Armata tank and the Russian drone program, have been delayed, because the need to replace Western or Taiwanese microchips in Russian military equipment with Russian-made equipment and with Russian-made software and with Russian devices, that of course has delayed these programs. But they are now starting to enter service. Russian drones like the Orion drone, the Altius drone, for example, are now entering service, and they apparently use only Russian microchips, and so do other Russian weapon systems. Now, we don't fully know the extent of Russian microchip production. It's probably nowhere near on the scale that you would find in places like Taiwan or indeed in the United States itself. And it's almost certainly Russian microchips, high-end microchips, top-end microchips, the kind made by the Rosneft Corporation, are surely, almost certainly, not as powerful or as advanced as the very top-end microchips made in Taiwan and in South Korea. But we come back to this. The fact is, a microchip industry does exist in Russia, which it didn't before. It's growing in size. It's producing ever larger quantities of microchips. And of course, in the vast majority of applications, including, by the way, military applications, you do not need those very top-end microchips. In fact, the great bulk of microchips that are used in most products are lower-end microchips, which Russia already produces. And by the way, it's also an option for the Russians to import microchips from China. And of course, China produces microchips in enormous quantities, and it is working towards developing top-end microchip production comparable to that of Taiwan as well, and is already apparently very advanced in doing so. Apparently, the Chinese have already, to a great extent, mastered the industrial process. And we come back to a program that I did some time ago about technology sharing between China and Russia. The Chinese have mastered this production of top-end microchips. The likelihood is that the Russians will too. After all, the Russians and the Chinese share technologies. Highly likely that production of top-end microchips in Russia will start fairly soon, either on the basis of Chinese technologies or on the basis of Russian technologies. Let's remember, Russia has an advanced space program. It has developed hypersonic glide vehicles before the United States. It has fielded hypersonic missiles. It clearly has an advanced chemical industry, an advanced material industry. It's shown that it has great facility in electronic warfare devices. It's already shown that some of its aircraft, some of its military equipment has fairly sophisticated, or in fact indeed very sophisticated, electronic systems. There's been much talk, for example, that Russia doesn't produce AESA radars for its fighter jets, but Russia does produce lots of AESA radars. It's just that the priority for those radars goes not to its fighter jets, but to its surface-to-air missile systems. So it's not entirely clear what the United States, what these officials imagine these technology restrictions will achieve. The United States, after all, did prevent the Soviet Union from importing technology, and the Soviet Union had, as a result, or perhaps in consequence, a fairly advanced science and technology base. My own sense is that the Russian science and technology base, having overcome some of the bureaucratic rigidities of the Soviet system, is probably capable of further advance. And of course, it can fall back on its Chinese friend to get through any particular problems. And perhaps this is where it all became rather curious, because there was a question, an actual question, directed at these administration officials by one of the questioners. The questioner directly asked this official, what is to prevent the Russians importing some of this technology from China? And the official accepted that the Russians would be able to import some of this technology from China, but he then went on to say that this would make the Russian economy brittle. What does that even mean? In what sense would it be brittle? It might become more dependent on China, but then China isn't sanctioning Russia. It would make Russia less dependent on high technology imports from the United States, to the extent, by the way, that they even exist anymore, at least to the extent that these officials appear to imagine. But that would not, it seems to me, make the Russian economy more brittle. It would make it more resilient. After all, it's not China that is sanctioning Russia. It is the United States which is sanctioning Russia. So if we are talking about brittleness, you make your economy less brittle by trading with a partner who is not going to sanction you than with the partner who is. Again, when one looks into this in detail, it doesn't make the kind of sense that these officials appear to imagine that it will. So again, it looks as if there's not going to be restrictions on imports of iPhones and things like that. I suspect US companies like Apple have not been keen on that idea anyway, and there's some comment on the part of the administration officials in this briefing about taking steps that would have minimal impact on the US economy. So it looks like the restrictions are going to be entirely at high-end exports, high-end technology exports. But even there, the Russians are not as dependent on the US as these officials appear to imagine. So, a lot of bullshit, a lot of bluff, a lot of talk about restrictions. To be very clear, if sanctions like this were imposed on the Russians, there would be a wobble. The Russian stock market would fall. There'd be pressure on the ruble. There would be pressure lasting perhaps for about a year. The economy would then adjust. It would then start to grow again. And we would start to see industrial development resume with a different technology architecture than perhaps is the case at the moment, though we must not overstate the extent to which the Russians depend anyway on Western technologies. So there it is. It's dealing with an empty hand. A lot of flesh-creeping talk about how these would be massive sanctions, but when analysed carefully, they turn out to be less, a great deal less than they appear. I'm going to add something else, and it goes back to that original point, the point about the fact that they would go, the official said that they would go to the very top of the escalation ladder. They say that they're going to go to the top of the escalation ladder, and they're going to stay there. This time we'll start at the top of the escalation ladder and stay there. That means, if you decipher what that means is that the United States, if it launches this sanctions package against Russia, it will have shot its bolt. There won't be any further sanctions which it can really realistically impose beyond these sanctions which are being discussed. Russia, as I said, can adjust and survive these sanctions and would rapidly adapt to them as it did to the sanctions which were imposed in 2014. So, what this briefing actually shows is the extent to which the United States is running out of sanctions options. This is the last throw, the last sanctions throw that is practical, and already it looks less impressive and less devastating than the US authorities essentially admit. If you are at the top of the escalation ladder, realistically, you cannot go higher. Now, I wonder to what extent this is really understood within the US government. I suspect that there must be some people within the economic departments of the US government, the high technology departments of the US government, who started to understand all of this. And that may explain why, after this briefing, we're seeing much more conciliatory words starting to come out of the US government than was the case just a few days ago. So to give an example, we've now had comments from US President Biden. President Biden gave this briefing last week in which he said that he thought that Putin was intending to invade Russia. Well, in his latest briefing, he goes out of his way to say that he doesn't actually know. He can't actually say for certain what President Putin is thinking of doing. He says that it's all a question of trying to read the tea leaves, and he can't work it out. So it's not really for him to say. He can't really work it out at all. He doesn't know. Well, it would have been helpful if he'd admitted that before, but already we see that there is a scaling down. It's not the case any longer that we're sure that Russia is going to invade. It's perhaps just a guess that they might do so. And then Biden again categorically ruled out any possibility of US and NATO forces being deployed in Ukraine itself. And he also categorically admitted that this placing of those 8,500 troops on standby means that they're just on a 5-day standby instead of a 10-day standby, and that he merely meant by that they would be deployed as part of a NATO package, and it would not be a unilateral move by the United States. So actually rather conciliatory words from President Biden over the last few days, words which appear to reduce the possibility, reduce the fear that there's going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, or that talk about an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. He's scaling back on that. He's admitting that he doesn't really know what Putin's intentions are, and he also says that this deployment of 8,500 troops isn't in fact a deployment. It's just a higher alert status for these troops, one which doesn't necessarily mean that they will be deployed at all. By the way, I would add one further point about these deployments of these 8,500 troops. They are, of course, the United States' Rapid Reaction Forces, Rapid Reaction Airborne Force. They can't be kept in Europe indefinitely, because if they were kept in Europe, the United States would not be in a position to deploy these troops rapidly elsewhere in the event of a crisis. So unless the United States replaces them with other troops, it would have to call them back anyway. And that brings us, of course, to a point repeatedly made by the brilliant commentator and former US Marine officer and intelligence official Scott Ritter, that there is a finite number of US troops anyway. The US military is not indefinitely large, and that it cannot sustain vast armies in Europe to the extent that it once could any longer, because of the multiple challenges it is now facing in so many other places in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East and elsewhere. So even these military deployments have the look of bluff about them, and in his latest comments, President Biden all but admitted as much. So there we go. Perhaps a dialing down of the fever as the recognition that the sanctions might not be quite as devastating on Russia as has been said, and the fact that by imposing these sanctions, the United States would effectively shot its bolt, fired its silver bullet, a silver bullet which the Russians would dodge. and which the Russians would survive, leaving the United States out of further ammunition. I said yesterday that I thought that we are past the tipping point of the Ukrainian crisis, that in fact it seemed to me that the more people in the United States have come to think about this, the more they're starting to recognize that this isn't really playing out well at all for the West, and whatever it was that the United States was looking to achieve by dialing up the hysteria around this issue, that had basically run its course. And this briefing in the White House has, for my part, strongly reinforced that belief. I think that lots of other people are now coming to the same conclusion. Today, as I am making this video, Vladimir Putin is hosting a massive delegation of Italian business leaders. All the biggest Italian companies are there. All of them want to trade and do business with Russia. Apparently, they don't believe that a sanctions war is imminent, and they presumably don't believe that a crisis in Ukraine is imminent either. It's a bluff which, to a great extent, has already been called. We will see what comes over the next few days. But as I said, in terms of this fake crisis, this phony crisis conjured up out of the whole cloth, a crisis over a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has never been threatened, I think that has probably now started to run its course. And we will see over the next few days the pressure and the hysteria and the anger around it start to ebb away. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. And I hope that you will join me also on our Locals platform. Well, I've spoken for just over an hour. Complex topic, all about sanctions, had to be discussed in some detail. Thank you for joining me again today. I'll stop now, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.